And now, 40 some odd years later, he was 82 years old. I went back home for a little talk, and he pulled me aside. He was on a cane, and he said, I want to ask you a favor. He'd never asked me a favor. He never asked me for anything in my life. Okay, what? I want you to do my eulogy. Now, I was stunned. I mean, first of all, I hadn't been very religious. I'd kind of walked away from it. I was raised with a lot of it, but as an adult, I really walked away from it. I only came home basically for the high holiday services. Secondly, who was I to do a eulogy for the guy who does eulogies? I mean, you know, I joke that I always thought priests and pastors and rabbis had that all worked out with one another. You know, if I go first, you do me. You go first, I'll do you. Yeah. So who was I to get in this loop? And the only thing I could think of was, well, if I'm going to do this, I need to get to know you as a human being. I mean, how could I possibly speak of you, send you off to heaven if I don't know you that way? I've only known you from the seats, as most congregants probably know their pastors or priests or rabbis. So he said, fine, I accept. Come get to know me. And that began a series of visits, which I thought might take a few months, because let's face it, when somebody asks you for your eulogy, you kind of figure that, you know, maybe time is short. But it ended up lasting 8 years because he survived several strokes and heart attack and cancer scare. And so that 8 years became like this sort of re-education of faith and a sort of a lassoing and a slow pull back to what I had been when I was younger. And that was happening in one side of my life when I would go visit him back in this little town where I grew up. The second part, as you point out, was happening where I currently live in Detroit, a devastated city, terrible unemployment. I work with the homeless there. I have a charity that funds shelters, and I had heard about this unusual homeless shelter that was run out of a church that was decaying and dilapidated and falling down and was so old that it had a hole in its roof where rain and snow literally came in during the winter time, and it got so cold in there that they had to build a plastic tent inside their own sanctuary, a plastic tent just to be warm enough to pray. And here people would gather in their coats praying for a better day in the 21st century in the United States of America, which to me was just shameful. And so I went to go see this shelter, and I met the pastor. And when I first met him, I mean, he came around the corner, he was wearing a white t-shirt, he's 400 pounds easily, thick arms, he's sweating from his forehead, carrying a box. I thought he worked there. And he held his hand out and he said, you know, my name is Henry Covington. And at the beginning, I have to say I didn't trust him. I mean, within 5 minutes, he's telling me he'd been in jail, he'd been a drug dealer, he'd been a thief. I mean, I said, it's nice that you're being honest, but don't you at some point get disqualified from the pulpit, you know? And yet, I slowly began to get to know him privately, the same way that I was getting to know the Reb privately. And these two very, very different worlds, as you point out, began to come together in my point of view. And they came together through one thing, faith, this powerful, powerful thing, belief that there's something bigger than us, and that belief and God will carry us through our difficulties. In the pastor's case, the broken down church, is he going to be able to keep it going? In the rabbi's case, his impending death.
Let's talk about the Reb. What was it about this guy that had such a profound influence on your life? And as you go through the book, he did begin to have a profound influence. And you know, it's interesting because Morrie had a big influence on your life. Yeah. In a sense, could it be said it almost slowed you down a bit so that you then could do what you did with the Reb and with Henry?
I think that's very astute. I don't think I would have ended up writing this book if I hadn't written Tuesdays with Morrie. I would have been on a whole different path. I certainly would not be sitting here with you. But I think I had learned that there's value in slowing yourself down, and when somebody catches your passion, your heart, you need to pay attention to it. And he had always been the Reb, which is what we called him as kids. It was like a superhero nickname, you know, the Thing, the Hulk, the Reb, you know, because he was such a powerful guy. He had always been charming and funny, and he loved to sing. And you know, even the first time I went to go visit him at his home, which I had never done before, and he opened the door, instead of him being in a robe or a suit, which is the only things I'd ever seen him in, he was wearing Bermuda shorts, black socks with sandals, which is a terrible look, and a plaid shirt and a vest. I mean, he looked like he'd fallen asleep in a rummage sale and just woken up with whatever was on him. And he loved to sing. and he sang every sentence of, he'd rather sing a sentence than say it. And so as soon as I asked him, how are you doing? Instead of saying fine, or he said, the old gray rabbi ain't what he used to be, ain't what, you know, and that's how he used to go. So he was so engaging. You couldn't help but want to be around him. And right from the get-go, I sensed that I was in the presence of a person that I had not really gotten to know, and he dealt in this world of faith that I really hadn't allowed myself to go in. One of the first things we did when I walked in that first day in his office, there were files up on the shelves, and of course I'm taking it all in because it's my first time, and I see a file with the name God on it. Just a file on, he had a file on God. I'm thinking, wow, who gets to keep a file on God? And what's in the file on God? And I asked him, one of the first questions, do you believe in God? I figured I'll open strong. And he said, yes, I do. And I said, do you talk to God? I talk to God all the time. What do you say to God? And he sang his answer. He said, well, these days I say, dear Lord, if you're going to take me already. And if you're going to leave me here, leave me with enough strength to help my congregation. And I said, wow. Well, do you get an answer? And he looked at me and he smiled. He said, still waiting, you know. And I just thought, wow, you know, I don't have these kinds of discussions with people on a regular basis, talking to God, asking him questions, then he says still waiting for an answer and still has that belief. So I knew that I was getting a chance to see something special. I didn't know how long it would last because I thought he was near death's door. I mean, a eulogy request sort of suggests that. The fact that we got 8 years together, albeit, you know, through some health scares, ended up making the education that much richer.
What surprised you the most about him?
That he had had doubts along the way. You know, I think when you're a kid in a congregation, you just assume that your priest or your pastor or rabbi has always been fervent. He lost a daughter when she was 4 years old, before I was even born, so I don't recollect any of it. She was 4, she had an asthma attack in the middle of the night. It was in the 50s, they didn't know really how to deal with asthma. And they rushed her to the hospital, and within an hour, a doctor comes out and says, sorry, we couldn't save her. Wow. And to hear those kinds of words, and he howled at God. I mean, he said, how could you do this to me? You know, haven't I done enough for you? Aren't I working hard enough for you? What did she do? She was 4 years old. And I said to him, well, didn't that make you question the existence of God? And he said, no. It was the existence of God and having something to howl at and having something to get angry at and ask why that enabled me to heal. He said, I would much rather have that than to believe that there's nothing out there at all and there's no answer to the question at all. And to hear him say that he had had doubts, to hear him say that he had failed in the seminary at the first time around. I didn't know that. I thought, foolishly now that I look back on it, that I thought that all men of God, priest, pastor, rabbi, whatever, had a revelation. I asked him, well, what was your revelation? He said, what do you mean? Well, didn't you have a voice of God came to you like a burning bush or something? Did you have a burning bush? He said, no, I wanted to be a teacher. I said, a religious teacher? No, a history teacher. And he just sort of eventually got into it. And they told him the first time he went to the seminary, they told him he didn't have what it took to be a rabbi. This blew my mind because anyone who knew him, I mean, he was the best you could ever hope for. So, I mean, there are many examples like that, but I think everything kind of surprises you when you get to know men of God behind the robes and away from the pulpit and out of Sundays or Saturdays, wherever they are.
But you think perhaps, Mitch, that one of the problems with even the seminary saying that to him is the criteria, the social criteria of what it takes to do that, and really what it takes from a human experience. He was more human than scholar.
And maybe they were looking, you know, based on the academics or based on some kind of model. But he very quickly figured out, he told me the very first service he had in 1948, he showed up for the Saturday, and he had everything, the academic way that they had told him to do it. Make your point A academically, point B academically, connect them through biblical verses. And he delivered his sermon that way, and he saw people yawning. And he saw that they were, you know, dropping off, and he said, this isn't working.
I've heard those sermons.
Yeah, haven't we all?
I've been there.
Haven't we all? And he immediately figured out, no, the important thing here is not to honor the academia. The important thing here is to reach the people. He became a brilliant sermonizer because he broke the mold.